Greg Souders has coached multiple jiu-jitsu champions using the constraints-led approach. Mike Israetel has trained jiu-jitsu through more traditional approaches and asked Greg this question.
How would you say it differs from traditional training, or at least much of the traditional training we see in jiu-jitsu?
So in this video, I'm going to go through what I think the constraints-led approach is, the supporting scientific evidence, and how you could use it in your own coaching. But to start with, I want to discuss Josh's question first.
If we're doing the evidence battle, how do people know who to listen to?
If we test two groups of people in different ways, we can see if one approach is better than the other. For that test, the problem is that academic tests aren't the same as coaching. Different people, different sports, different skills, different levels, just lots and lots of differences. The biggest difference being time. Most studies are relatively short compared to movement development over, well, years and even decades. So researchers and coaches discuss the reasons why tests might work. What the test did is still useful if you're coaching the same thing, but why one approach is better than another is how we can create other better practices. The reasons why then being tested in future studies to see if we were right or not. So there are two different kinds of evidence here. One, evidence for what practice is effective, and two, evidence for why practice is effective. The biggest problem with coaching movement is the degrees of freedom problem. Each piece of porridge is a movement I can use to make the whole movement I want. If I want to pick up an object, I need to find the right pieces of porridge to get the whole movement I want. Finding the solution in all of this will take me hours. But if I add some constraints to where I'm looking, then the right solution is easier to find. However, the solution is changing every moment, so finding the right solution every movement is just impossible. But there is more than one solution. Bernstein measured different skilled blacksmiths hitting a hammer at the same spot. He assumed to hit the same spot, the blacksmiths would use the same technique. But the study showed variability with each hit. Highly skilled performers using different movements to achieve the same goal. Say you want to throw a ball really fast, you could do it with a bent elbow, like in a baseball pitch. Or you could do it with a straight arm, like in a cricket bowl. There are constraints changing these solutions used. Task constraints, like the rules of a sport. Environmental constraints, like the wind. Then individual constraints, which could be structural, like your physical size, or functional, like your level of fatigue. But all of these constraints, like the solutions, change and interact. Moving my hands together, or individually, changes how the porridge, movements, move. The more we constrain, the easier it is to find a solution. Mike refers to this as shortcuts, Greg constraints.
How do you think it works faster without taking all of these sort of well-accumulated shortcuts that we've developed?
They're not shortcuts. They're tighter constraints.
Task constraints are often what coaches manipulate in practice, and as Greg said very nicely.
And most of the reason I think we are is because coaches like to fucking talk. Okay, we want to be these gurus who just yap at our students. But we have better mechanisms for trying to get what we want to get.
So why I use my hands and not like chopsticks to move the porridge becomes the next question. Both get me to the solution, but one is more effective than the other. The reasons why we pick a constraint is the problem being discussed in the science, as Greg mentions.
Well, for sure, absolutely. But we have to be careful when we say the ecological approach, because all we mean when we say that is that direct perception at some level is happening. That the information we're gaining from the things we're doing does not need to be interpreted by the brain. So that's all that, when someone says an ecological approach, that's all they mean. They're not saying anything about sparring or situational sparring or CLA really. So everyone's throwing this word around, eco this, eco that. It's almost meaningless.
Then, after that conversation, Mike did a follow-up with Cal Jones, another CLA-focused coach, and said,
I understand it's a term you guys use in the subfield, but there's no alternative to an information processing perspective. The only thing your brain does is information processing. How you learn from ecological dynamics is only information processing. So it's just like a little bit of a confusing term because everything is information processing as soon as it hits your eyes and it leaves your hands, everything in between is information processing. Like, how can it be any other way? Or is that just nomenclature using to talk about a very specific idea of what information processing is?
So there are two different approaches to psychology and perception science here. Greg and Cal talking about ecological psychology and direct perception. Mike talking about traditional cognitive psychology and indirect perception. Either could be used to explain why a constraint is picked. There are some consistencies, but some big differences. I am the glass, and I know there is another glass over there, but how do I know? Well, I have senses like eyes to see what is going on, so I assume the information from outside of me, the rice, can be used to help me know about the other glass. Assuming the world, both glasses, exists is realism, which both approaches agree on. The information being used to know things are happening through experiences is known as empiricism, which is also agreed on. We learn from our experiences. However, some believe we start with no knowledge, an empty glass, and build it up over time. Others don't. Some argue growing as a human inside of a womb or a hawk inside of an egg is knowledge that could be used, but also our body holds some knowledge like requiring food to survive, and how we go to get the food will depend on our capabilities, what we can do. So information available to a human is different to a hawk. Wings for flying, 2 legs for walking, very different from birth. But both of these beliefs also assume we use our senses to somehow inform us about the world using information, the rice. The somehow part is the main difference. Sensed information going to the person or organism, but how do we know the information is right? We assume there is a world, realism, but we only know about the world through information we are sensing. Considering our retinal image is upside down and 2D, we could say the information isn't good enough or impoverished. Dirty rice. One approach is to correct these sensing issues. We clean the rice. A thing, sometimes referred to as our mind, controller, or central executive, helping us perceive in 3D. Glass of water. Mike refers to a part of the brain for 3D representation.
It's actually the only way it gets done, because the nervous system detecting the ball and then sending at least some kind of signal to various muscles has to happen for you to see the ball, because if we severed the part of your brain that's involved in three-dimensional representation, you usually wouldn't understand that a ball is coming at you.
But we are perceiving information through something else. It's being cleaned. So we are indirectly perceiving the world. The other approach removes the something else. We don't need to clean the rice. As Cal and Greg both say, we are directly perceiving. There either is a mind, central executive, or something processing the impoverished information, or there isn't. We clean the rice or we don't. So I assume Mike believes we indirectly perceive, and we start with no knowledge as he asked Greg this question.
How do you go about teaching someone who doesn't know any jiu-jitsu how to do jiu-jitsu to someone if they don't know what moves to do at all? Which
begs the next question. What does this processing thing, cleaning the rice, do? Simply put, it suggests that it looks at what is most likely. The clean rice telling me the object I am sensing has been a ball 3 times before, so it most likely will be a ball again. But that relies on the water glass, central executive, knowing the cleaned rice was clean the first time. The water glass, central executive, isn't connected to us or the world, so how does it know what is clean? It must have started with lots of information about what clean means before it got the rice to know it was clean to send to us. This is known as a loan of intelligence. Programmers loan intelligence for robots to function, but who or what loans this disconnected central executive, water glass, that information? This has been referred to as the homunculus problem in optimization. My water glass needs a water glass to tell it what is clean, which also needs a water glass, and so on and so on. This image showing an imaginary controller person instead of a water glass. And yes, the Inside Out movies are also perfect examples of this, angry needing an angry inside of it. But Mike says he doesn't think this is what's happening.
Also, there is a motor homunculus. Like, it's a real thing. It's not a little man that makes executive decisions, but it's a mapping of where all of your muscles and effector organs are able to output to.
So unless I'm misunderstanding, Mike's suggesting we need help perceiving, but don't need help acting. We can clump rice to create a schema or a motor program, which is stored in the glass, our long-term memory, and used to move. Like a robot executing a command. But here's a couple of problems. The blacksmith research suggests there is variability with each movement, so the clumps of rice need to change each time we move. Then, if these clumps are solutions, we could assume that we can break them up and put them back together again. If we train, say, volleyball players to react and move to a sphere, that will, as Mike said, groove in the movement.
To your point, perceptually live, and then just by emphasizing certain actions in your head, you end up instinctually, something that can only be developed in live practice, can't develop with drilling, you can instinctually call to very well drilled moves to execute them. They are now very, very low cognitive bandwidth because they're very well grooved in, very subconscious. Even as you're doing one of those moves, if you're fresh and new to it, you got to do the move and you're thinking only about what's going on.
The idea being you can break up behavior into parts, the visual reaction and the spiking movement, and put it back together again. But this volleyball example was tested. Our results have shown that vision training in non-sport specific context improved cognitive performance, but seems to be less effective for improving sport-specific skills. So they got good at what they trained, but it didn't transfer to the full sport very well. The FTC has issued fines for deceptive marketing about vision training transfer because the evidence just doesn't support the claims. But also fined Lumosity $2 million for related brain training deceptive marketing because the evidence doesn't support the claims. A football study looked at training isolated movements compared to ones with more decision-making over 22 weeks, separating the clumps of rice or doing the entire process multiple times with variations. The results showed significant differences in favour of the experimental group in decision-making and the execution of passes after the intervention. However, such differences weren't found for dribbling, but no isolated practice, no focus on a best technique, and no technical instruction found better results. If we look at a few anecdotal high-level performance examples, football players holding tennis balls during practice, baseball players using hula hoops, and then one of the greatest tennis players of all time hitting the ball deliberately on the wrong side of the net first. I talk more about this later. But they're not practicing an ideal motor program, schema, or clump of rice, they're exploring variability. Comparing professional golfers, we can see an average mechanics create a best golf swing. Elbow at 130 degrees, shoulder at 66 degrees, away from the body, and trunk rotation at 60 degrees. But none of the professionals match that best technique. It was an average used by no one. Variability has also been found in swimming profiles and essentially all human behaviour. Separating perception and action, assuming action is stored somewhere and executed, isn't well supported by the evidence. No dry clump of rice solution. It's why ideas from traditional cognitive psychology, motor programs and schemas are being left behind for more modern approaches, active inference and generative models. Mike asks a great question.
How can you possibly know how to do a really good double leg having trained it for years if you're not storing some representational model of how to activate various muscles in coordination to do it?
And this is where dynamic generative models differs from a static program. Dry clump of rice, wet, changing clumps of rice. But Greg answers by saying,
The muscles activate relative to the demands of the task. So as I search the space to act out on it, I respond in kind and directly to the demands of the task.
More like putting the glass in a bowl of rice, exploring the solution space, and active inference is probably more like this as well, but with water still inside the glass to clean up the rice. But Mike makes another great point.
The storage is something that's sub or unconsciously executed for you. You're not aware that you have a motor program until you try to move in the world and realize, oh, I'm moving in a way that I learned a ton before.
We don't need awareness of this program or model to move. This is where I would say the evidence for why and what is most effective gets pretty difficult. I could give a child a full-size tennis racket and tell them to hit a ball 10 meters away. My why could be to train a motor program from traditional cognitive psychology. Or my why could also be for them to explore movements with a full-size racket from modern cognitive psychology or ecological psychology. But we have seen that using a scaled tennis racket is more effective for accuracy, but also exploring movement variability. Which, if all movements are unique, then exploring variability is pretty important for long-term skill development. This figure shows those using scaled rackets explore the solution space far more than the full-sized racket. The full-size racket constraining the children's movements more, potentially due to weight, size, or previous practice. What the coach did was the same, but why was different. The different whys making an impact later on in the practice, which relates to when Mike and Greg talking about complexity.
That seems to deal with the fact that your cognitive bandwidth is a constrained entity. It's really difficult to make sense of really complex things at the same time.
For
And
sure.
if you start with simple things that build up into building blocks for more complex things, then eventually you can sort of keep that same cognitive bandwidth. Once you understand the simpler stuff, you sequence it into more complex things, then eventually more complex things. That doesn't mean like you just drill for a year and then you do positionals for a year and then you live roll for a year. There's a place for all of those at all the same time, but it does mean potentially that there are distinct benefits in drilling that are not as efficiently gained through live work.
Starting simple, then adding complexity. But simple and separated are different things. The volleyball study mentioned earlier is an example of separated or decontextualized practice. The why, train a motor program, could lead to separating up practice from the sport, but training in non-sport specific contexts is less effective for improving sport-specific skills. Then the why explore different movement solutions could lead to effective and ineffective movements, but still in sport-specific context.
And they're best run in a sequence from basic techniques to combinations to live over the course, potentially of one training session, maybe a week, definitely a month, for sure years, and even potentially a career span. And so like first you learn how to dribble and then you learn how to shoot, or both at some points, and then you can, once you know how to dribble statically, you can dribble dynamically.
No.
And then once you have basic techniques set up, you go through phases of integrating them into combinations, like just using the basketball example.
Yeah.
Now, from what I heard and understand, Mike likely follows the old Fitz and Posner model. It wasn't mentioned, but Mike talks about moving through stages of learning. However, the football study mentioned earlier found more complex tasks with decision making got the same results or better results than simple tasks. Then, when children learn to ride a bike, this study found low variability on a bike with training wheels leads to 75% success. Kids learn to ride a bike on their own in 10 sessions. But high variability practice on a balance bike, a bike with no training wheels or pedals, led to 100% success. Higher variability, messy, complex practice leading to better results faster. But Mike said,
messy behavior does not imply learning. The only thing that implies learning is sequentially measuring output on that given task and watching the escalating performance go up.
Which highlights another important point for us as coaches, measuring performance. Does the performance need to be going up to show learning? Jenny Busick, an MBA coach, said this about random and blocked practice.
We usually, as coaches, block train because it's clean, it's organized, it's neat, it feels good, it feels like we had a great practice. And then we wonder why, when we get in the game, they can't make a decision.
Measuring performance after 1 hour, 1 day, or 2 weeks from training could show different results. If we look at this basketball study, testing chest, sidearm, and overhead passes with blocked or random practice, they practiced each pass and were tested 1 hour, 1 day, and 2 weeks afterwards. An hour after practice, the blocked group were better. 1 day after practice, and the random group were better. 2 weeks after practice, the random group were better, but they were retaining their performance, whereas the blocked group were still getting worse. Blocked practice got high performance in the short term, but lower performance in the long term with poor retention rates. Extending this over weeks, months, or even years, this is significant. Benefits of random practice appear to be that learners are more actively engaged. Learners are given more opportunities to acquire more meaningful experiences of various tasks, helping retention, and learners will likely perform better in the next practice sessions. And so ideas about teaching simple fundamentals first, static dribbling, then dynamic dribbling, could also be challenged. Mike gives this example about punching.
If I teach you how to punch pretty well, all the good mechanics of punching, changing the direction
What are
of the
good
punch.
mechanics of punching?
Say what?
What are good mechanics of punching?
Making sure you're not just using your chest and triceps, but putting in your whole body, doing a hip dip and then pushing through your hips, rotating the trunk, just basic stuff. If I teach you how to do that with any kind of punch, and then I teach you, okay, now punch in this direction, now punch in that one, now punch in that one, I'm relying on that basic architecture to express itself more complexly, and thus I elevate the ability to put it into other tasks or other applications,
Right, so
like
you're-
punching
so
there,
just-
there. But if I don't know how to punch really well, then that's a real big problem for me because I punch into every direction wrong.
Once we learn the basics of punching, we can just adjust it to everything else. But as discussed earlier with the hammer study, each movement is unique. With the volleyball study, each movement should be practiced in context. Then with the tennis study, learning changes with the constraints used. The golf analysis, everyone finds different effective solutions. And when we consider the optimal movement solution myth, the authors argue actual human performance is not optimal, but adaptive and is characterized by intermittent, contextual, and dynamically entangled processes across multiple scales. So picking a fundamental movement to rep out seems extremely difficult and begs the question, when does a rep start if we are keeping practice in the sport?
Well, a rep is an executed technique from start to finish. Like, I ankle pick you, I push your hip down, you fall on the ground, ankle pick successful.
But it's not
That's a
just
full
the
rep.
ankle pick. It's the stuff that's happening before the ankle pick and after the ankle pick and during the ankle pick. It's
I
the
think
stuff
it's just
that's
the
happening.
ankle pick, really. That's the
But
reps of
you
ankle
can't
pick.
use just the technique as the metric because the technique isn't just what's happening. If you watch a wrestling match, you don't just see techniques. If you watch a jiu-jitsu match, you just don't see techniques. There's grappling going on. There's
No, for
push,
sure.
pull.
And I think this is where opposed practice seems more representative of the sport. Fighting a person, not a bag. Dynamically transitioning between movements rather than repeating highly constrained movements. Unopposed, isolated, blocked practice, not ineffective, just maybe not as effective. These authors say coaches should ask, does the movement problem contain relevant sources of information for the athletes to regulate their movements? Punching a bag, shadow boxing, virtual reality boxing, all experiences of boxing, so you can learn from them. But virtual reality boxing is not training fundamentals, it's fighting. As the VR boxing champion found out, VR boxing is very different in person.
Score, mate. You're behind on points.
I am. Very behind. You're outscoring me.
Now, he's a little short with these punches. He needs to get his feet closer if he wants to have any success with us, just like you've got to do in the game.
Certainly room for improvement, but being the first time ever boxing with gloves, that looked fine to me. Yes, I coach trampoline, but I work with boxing coaches as well. VR boxing having more relevant sources of information than shadow boxing or punching a bag. It also skips the fundamentals. So how can we use this to help us coach? Well, we all manipulate constraints, but not to train a motor program, ideal movement, or fundamentals. Being a glass in a bowl of rice, I'm continuously perceiving and acting to achieve my goal in various ways. This could be referred to as self-organization. One study tested this when sounding out words. They tugged on the participant's jaw when they were saying words like bab. On the second B, when the jaw was tugged, the lips compensated to sound out bab. Movements work together to achieve a goal, not anatomical movements or a motor program. When tugging on the Z of Baz, the tongue compensated. All organisms self-organizing to achieve a goal. Constraints are in every practice, like sport rules, and all coaches add constraints. often task constraints. However, highly constrained practice often falls under the term linear pedagogy, the coach directing what to do. Fixed stages of development, like learning short distance passing, then long distance passing, repeating movements until some measure of mastery, grooving it in, as Mike said earlier. A session's aim to help everyone master the focused technique, specific anatomical movement patterns, the coach correcting errors from the ideal movement, giving learners the answers. Mostly consistent task and environment situations, similar rules and equipment, learners following the plan or tactics given out, and breaking down each skill step by step. This highly constrained practice is often referred to as drilling. Now, meanings are in people, not words, so when I think of drilling, I think of highly constrained linear pedagogy. Others might think of something else, but from what I've read, most of the literature suggests that drilling is highly constrained practice. But on the other side, we have games.
Oh, there's a failure condition.
We're playing a game. What are you joking?
Well, I thought games were like fun exploratory things in which you tried to see how your body moves in space.
What? We're playing a grappling game. I have to do things to you to try to win the game. If I have 30 seconds to do something to you to win the game and I have 10 minutes, it's going to change the speed at which we engage.
Two things to note here. 1, win condition. 2, fun. The study from earlier suggested random practice helps learners be more engaged, acquiring more meaningful experiences. Most games are less constrained than most drills, so more random. And if we look at the top 3 fun factors for young, old, male, female, recreational or professional, they all say the same things. Positive coaching, encouraging exploration and mistakes. Positive team dynamics, supportive attitudes towards challenge. And then the most important one, trying hard. Everyone wanting to push their own abilities. So yes, games are fun, but can and arguably should be used repeatedly with appropriate challenge, the win condition playing a huge role in that challenge. But winning doesn't have to be related to the coaching points, which is where looser constraints or nonlinear pedagogy describes player-centered practice working based on their needs, using lots of different scenarios, which is easier done in games than drills, encouraging adaptability, again, easier to do in games than drills, learners finding solutions that work for them with the goal given, self-assessment based on the practice scenarios, and in changing task and environmental constraints like the rules and equipment. Exploring different tactics and finding variable solutions with a coach using guided questioning alongside the learner's personal development through practice. You can see the differences between linear and non-linear pedagogy in this table of a 2025 study. They tested 40 people's passing success in 5-a-side football matches lasting 40 minutes. 2 halves of 20 minutes. The 2 groups were coached for 8 weeks in these different ways. They were tested again after the training, waited 4 weeks, and then were tested again for retention. You can see the 14-week training intervention in this table, and the results show significant differences. The first thing to note is that pre-tests showed no difference between the groups, so they were all starting as beginners. Post-testing, both groups significantly improved, but we can see the non-linear group improved significantly more than the linear group. The linear group didn't retain much of what they learned after 4 weeks out, dropping close to pre-test scores. Still retaining some improvement though. However, the non-linear group showed no significant difference between post and retention tests. The lower constrained, random, complex, non-linear pedagogy group got better, faster, and retain their learning for longer. More functional adaptability and variability in the training being the main difference discussed. But Mike was still a bit confused.
Something that's confused me a little bit about the constraints-led approach is this insistence on the fact that mental representations of movement don't exist, and that there is no homunculus, and that, like, for example, drilling has, depending on who you talk to, either no transfer of training to performance or very low transfer of training to performance. But from my experience, drilling has a contextual transfer of training to performance that's very good in some regards and very bad in others.
The role of our brain is a philosophical debate about human behaviour. Water in the glass, water out of the glass, or a separate water glass. The constraints-led approach isn't that. I think our focus should be on us as perceiving and acting together rather than as separate parts, as Julia, the author of the book An Introduction to Ecological Psychology, recently said.
So you were talking about people saying, okay, well, what does the brain do then? What does the brain do? And it's not that I don't think the brain is interesting. It's just sort of beside the point, right? The point is the interaction between me and my environment, and the brain is only part of that. It's not the whole of it.
But when I think about the use of drills, highly constrained practice, I would ask, how can we manipulate constraints to create functional variability in practice? That is what the constraints-led approach is consistently asking us coaches to do. How and why would we destabilize or challenge a movement solution? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. How and why would we encourage self-organization for a new solution? They will figure it out. How and why would we want to amplify certain information? Then, how can we help a learner experience feedback from the task goal? Jeff said this about constraints.
That's what I was going to say. If the constraints are in place to produce a particular kind of movement, then it's the wrong kind of constraint. If the constraints are in place to ensure a particular outcome, that's a different story.
Right.
But if we fully embrace the idea of exploring the solution spaces, it could explain why Novak Djokovic was deliberately hitting the ball on the wrong side of the net first. Amplifying errors helps people explore the entire solution space. In this golf study, one group were told the right way, one group were told the wrong way, and then the other group were told to do their own thing as a control group. The group told the wrong way improved, and the other groups didn't. Results showed that MAE, amplification of error, is an effective strategy for correcting the technical errors, leading to a rapid improvement in performance. A different study in baseball had two groups. One had the same goal throughout the training, to hit the ball into fair play. The other group had random goals with some wrong goals, like hit the ball as far left as you can or as far right as you can. This reminded me of Wii Sports, like foul ball. Anyway, we can see in figure 4 the variable group with error goals hit more balls on average, missed balls less, and hit more home runs. Ecological psychology isn't the constraints-led approach. The constraints-led approach encourages exploration of variability in practice by manipulating constraints to help learners self-organize in complex challenges. In this video, I talk about how Fabian Otter, a professional goalkeeping coach, uses the constraints-led approach with the Premier League football team, Liverpool.